So when we looked at, all the kind of development so far in the first millennium AD, one of the main things that we talked about, of course, was the consolidation of the state, right? How the state was becoming increasingly powerful in these different places in Japan, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and on the China landmass. But what was really the main characteristic of the consolidation process was the centrality of the bureaucracy, how the bureaucracy or the administration that was staffed by technocrats, right? Officials who had technical knowledge and good technical knowledge, essentially became the core of these states and the process of the state consolidation process that we saw. All right. And along with that, of course, is the development of the economy. No longer was it a simplistic command economy where we were looking at just the control of land, and then whatever the land could produce, that was what the state would take and appropriate. And then the state would then try to redistribute that throughout the entire society, right? So that would have been up to the Han period, or even just the early Han period, sort of the end of the first millennium BC. Okay, that would have been how we would have characterized the late Neolithic period, the Shang Bronze period, into the Western Zhou, the Spring Autumn period into the Warring States, and then ultimately into the Han Dynasty. But by the first millennium AD, the major economic development that was happening along with the consolidation of the state was that the state was no longer just appropriating land and its resources, but leveraging on things like land taxes, for example, market taxation, sales tax, customs duties, monopolies, and so on and so forth to manage its fiscal well-being. Okay. And so the economy became very sophisticated as a result of that through the course of the first millennium AD. What is interesting, because that process occurs all the way through in the first half of the first millennium AD and into the second half of the first millennium AD. Okay, but globally there was a second phenomenon that was occurring by about 700 AD and really sort of kicked in, I think, in terms of it, the actual impact of it by about 800 AD, was a period known as the medieval warm period. This is a global phenomenon where the atmospheric temperatures were steadily sort of increasing on the one hand, okay? And on the other hand, it was also characterized or accompanied by increasingly higher levels of rainfall on an annual basis, okay? The medieval warm period lasted from about 700 AD to about 1300 AD. And it actually had a huge impact all over the world, not just in East Asia, but in places like Southeast Asia and Europe and the Middle East and all that sort of thing. If you really think about the major developments in world history and that ascendancy of very, very sophisticated and economically well-to-do first-tier states in world history, right? If you think about the Abbasid dynasty from 750 AD onwards until about 1258 AD, right? It occurs when? In this period, okay? The Abbasid dynasty becomes one of the most important, powerful, and well-to-do, right? Sophisticated, cosmopolitan Middle Eastern caliphate, basically. The likes of which we do not see until I think probably about the 1700 AD period with the Ottoman Empire on its ascendancy. Okay, so it's a pretty amazing period of time. In Europe, you have the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of the Frankish state now known as France, and also Byzantium Rome, which in our opinion, you might look at it and think of it as a decline of the Roman Empire, right? But in essence, on its own, with its capital located in Istanbul or Constantinople, right? Istanbul today was really a period of rise. Okay, from over the 6th and 7th centuries AD onwards, and lasted for another about 700 years ago, the 14th century. Okay, so all these different sort of really powerful states, very well-to-do, occurs during this period of time. So the result, of course, is an increase in trans-regional interactions, right? So all these different parts of the old world connected together either by sea or by land allowed for economic, cultural, social interactions at at a level and an intensity that I think we didn't really quite see before. All right. And obviously it was facilitated and helped along by the fact that states were already well consolidated by the second half of the first millennium AD. Okay. So what do I mean by that? So a couple of graphs. So this is a reconstructed temperature sort of, fluctuation a graph. And the main thing to really understand is that in the medieval warm period, you notice from about the 7th century onwards, temperatures are gradually rising. But the other thing that's interesting is that the rise of the temperatures over time are not fluctuating in large bands, like it's like kind of a yo-yo thing, right? They're relatively narrow, peaks round about, I think from 10,000 BC, the 11th century, and then it starts to slowly decline in terms of the atmospheric temperature, but nonetheless, the band is relatively narrow. Okay, it doesn't really precipitously decline dramatically until about 1400. Okay, does anybody know what 13 to 1400 AD remind you of? Global history. Yeah, the Black Death, the plague, occurs over the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, right? So this is the period of what? The plague, okay? So before that, what we're seeing is essentially a very good period of time where the weather was relatively warm, and that meant that the growing seasons in the northern hemisphere were much longer, right, than they were before. Okay, so you could actually grow much more. Even the type of crops that you could be growing was quite different, and that was sort of roughly about the 7th century all the way until about the 13th century before all of that kind of changed. Okay, so here's another graph looking at the frequency of El Nino. Does anybody know what El Nino is? What's El Nino? Yeah, and what is the characteristic of that particular weather pattern?
It's a really large storm.
Okay, but then also what else? It's large storms over the Pacific, but what else happens? No? Okay, so El Nino is interesting because it's a phenomenon that is driven by storm systems across the Pacific due to certain atmospheric sort of temperature changes, right? Quite drastic. But the effect is that on land, the water actually doesn't reach the land, right? So it occurs over the oceans. And years when there are El Nino phenomenon in Asia, as well as in the US, you actually get a period of drought. Okay, so if you think about Arizona and the West over the last 10 years. So California, for example, is going through a period of what? Drought, right? Yeah. So they've had some rain last year, but over the last couple of years, they've not had rain. This year is pretty bad. All of that is driven by what is known as a El Nino phenomenon. And so what it means is that the ocean's water moisture does not reach the land in terms of rain. Okay. What's important for us to understand in this period, though, is that if you look at this point and this point, which is the period of the medieval warm period, the frequency of El Nino occurring is what? Extremely low. All right. So what it means is that consistently there is much more rainfall every year on year during this 500-year, 600-year period that we're looking at. Okay. And so not only is your growing season longer because the atmospheric weather is warmer, but there's also what? More moisture that is falling down from the sky. And so agriculture can develop much better during this period of time. Okay. And then this is just another example just to track what we call rainfall patterns in the cave. So for those of you how many of you have done environmental like science courses at all? Okay, have you all seen these sorts of graphs at all? Yeah, no? Okay, so the way that scientists try to track like how much rain has fallen, in like sort of a long period into the past, that there are a few methods that you can use depending on what's available in the region that you're looking at, right? So for example, in India, where trees are relatively scarce, but you have a lot of limestone caves, what you would look at is a graph like this, right? That plots the growth of stalagmites. So that's the limestone thing that's kind of hanging from the ceiling and sort of coming down in a cone shape because of the dripping of the water, right, in the limestone rock bed. And so this is essentially plotting how much water there is. And of course, in the medieval warm period, because of the low frequency of El Nino, what happens is there is much more rain. And so the stalagmites are growing at a much faster rate because more water is dripping through, right, the limestone caves. So in places where there might not be caves of this nature, but there are massive forests, for example. Okay, so like in Thailand, the teak forest can be about 1,000 or 2,000 years old. What you do is you cut the tree down. I mean, it's a horrible way of doing it, but you cut the tree down and you look at the tree rings. So in years when there's a lot of water, what happens in terms of the tree growth? It's much more, right? So the ring thickness year on year is much thicker. And in years where there's less water, the ring does not grow as much, okay? So that's how they actually do some of these different ways of trying to track annual rainfall over like 1,000-year, 1,500-year period, right? Does it make sense? Yeah? Okay, so what am I trying to say? All I'm trying to say is that from about the 780 period onwards through to about 1380, for 600 years, we were literally looking at weather patterns, atmospheric patterns that were really advantageous to agricultural output, right? And so not only in China, not only in places like Southeast Asia, not only in places like the Middle East, but in Europe as well, the Alps were literally growing wheat there. The people were growing wheat on the slopes of the Alps, right? Which then came to an end around about 400 AD, okay? And so overall, globally, the world was not only well connected together, but I think it was also benefiting from, let me just get back to this later, right? So not only was the world benefiting from a growth, right, in the agricultural output, and so the wealth base was larger, right? The more food you have, the more people you will therefore have, right? So this sounds familiar when we're thinking about the Shang dynasty, right? Okay, so this is a repeat of the same pattern. So much larger population. So the economic pie globally is what? Enlarging, okay? And so as all of these different regions are growing economically, benefiting from an enlarging population base, they are connected together by maritime routes and by land. And so you have a map that connects the world of this nature, right? Things from the west are moving towards the east. Things that are in the south here in the Indian subcontinent, for example, are going both in terms of a eastward direction as well as a westward direction, and so on and so forth, right? The world is connected during this period of time both by sea and by land, and the volume of exchange is pretty large. So here, for example, is a 9th century bas relief from Southeast Asia on the island of Java, which is located here. Okay, so Java is kind of out of the map. It would be here if the map was extended any further. Okay, this is a very large Buddhist stupa that was built in the 9th century, and on its walls, at the side of the walls, is the story of the Buddha known as the Jatakas. And so it's really talking about an Indic story, right? You know, the Buddha story and all these sermons and all that. But in terms of the scenes where there is the scene, well, you know, you have depictions of this. So this is, for example, a Southeast Asian vessel. Okay. And so Southeast Asian people were fitting ships that were large, sailing abroad to places like China, India, the Middle East, and so on and so forth, facilitating that exchange. These vessels are huge. They can carry about 300 to 400 tons of cargo. So there's a huge amount of cargo. So the volume of exchange is what, extremely large. Okay. The Middle Easterners as well, themselves from the Middle East, from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, were building vessels of this nature. Not as large as the Southeast Asian vessels, but still quite big. This vessel, for example, is a reconstruction of an early 9th century shipwreck that was excavated off the coast of Indonesia. And so the Sultanate of Oman decided that they would spend money to reconstruct something like this and sail it just to see what it looks like. This is the result of that reconstruction project. It has a displacement of about 160 tons. So again, it's not as large as the Southeast Asian vessels, but you can carry a lot of cargo, okay, in a vessel of this nature. The shipwreck, by the way, that was excavated off the coast of Indonesia, from which this reconstruction is based, was carrying something like 60,000 pieces of ceramics, a whole bunch of silver ingots from China, lead, foodstuffs, all sorts of containers and all that sort of stuff. So the amount of cargo that is carried is pretty large, right? Not to mention the number of people that could actually travel as passengers on these vessels as well. So here's another picture. This is a Chinese vessel that's dated to the early 13th century. That was excavated in 1971. And it had a displacement of about 300 tons as well. And so the cargo is, you put it in the hull, in the cargo hold here, and the ship would then sail to Southeast Asia. This ship was on the way back from Southeast Asia when it sank off the coast of China, and we know that because the cargo was still completely intact. You had peppercorns in there, aromatic woods, cinnabar, which is a kind of mercury oxide, right? That is mined, and all of those were made available in Southeast Asia. So the Chinese were going out in their ships too, right, to buy all these things and bring it back. Okay, so all of that is to say that by sea, you had a vibrant global, right, all world global exchange. Okay, products from all over the place were moving to other parts of the world, including places like China, Japan, and Korea. And China, Japan, and Korea were producing economic products to be shipped abroad. Okay, so the economy, the manufactured economy in this period of time was really very sophisticated, and the volume of exchange was very large. Right? You have to think of this as all those shipping containers that are parked outside of the port of LA right now, waiting to unload, right? The Christmas gifts for this Christmas, okay? Because you can move huge quantities, right, of product. So that, the Barbie doll that's made in China, for example, can sell at Walmart for like $15, okay? If you had something like a land route of this nature, which was also coexisting with the shipping lines, right? Here, your camel caravans across Central Asia, the land Silk Road, usually could not be more than about 30 camels, because by the time you had to feed and water like lots and lots of camels, it would eat into all the profits that you had, right? If you were a merchant that was running a camel caravan, right? And then too few camels, if you had, maybe just 15 or 10 camels trying to go across the Silk Road, you won't be able to generate enough income in order to make the caravan route worth the while. So about 25 to 30 camels was about right. You went from one oasis city to another. But the result is that how much can you carry on camels? Not as much, right? I mean, some stuff, but not as much as the ships. So if you are operating the land route across Central Asia, chances are you'll be dealing in high value commodities. Okay, so whereas the sea lanes were dealing with things that were of lower value, okay, so large quantity, low unit value, profit margin might be thin, but overall, because of the volume that you were operating in, you could be very profitable. On the camel caravan route, you tended to be low volume, high value, so that your profit margin would be very high. Yeah.
Especially since going on ships back then used to be a lot more dangerous than now. So they would want to put low value stuff on there so nothing would happen. Or something could happen and it would be that costly.
Right. And so there would be the calculation of the risk cost as well, right? And so when you have shipping lines being developed, one of the things that will happen is that you will go for volume and low unit because the actual risk cost is relatively low compared to. So you have to think of it this way. If I had a container that's about 32 feet long, right? I'm going to put things like, I don't know, plastic containers, for example, like boxes and boxes of pencils that, and all sorts of things like that. Now, I will be able to sell that on the other end and make a good profit out of it. But I won't necessarily jam pack the entire container with what? Diamonds, right? Gold bars, things like that. Like those I would reserve with a courier who has 2 luggages, okay, and probably another hand carry, taking a plane, right? Because that is the way to do it because of the high value, right, commodity that I'm transferring. Okay, so we have to think about this way. Camel caravans tend to be high value, low volume, and then shipping is low value, high volume. So that's a good observation. Okay, questions, anybody at this juncture? No? All right. So the result of all of those developments is that we see, in some sense, 3 phenomena developing in East Asian society, right? The first one would be a consolidation and growth of the bureaucratic state, okay? So as all these economic developments are occurring, and as the state gets richer, as agricultural output increases over time because of the climate, right? The conducive climate, and the bureaucracy grows in size, right? Because there are more and more people that you now have to administer compared to the past. So I think at the peak of this period, for example, China's total population base, according to the official census that they have records on, was roughly about 200 million people. That's a lot. I mean, like China's like the largest, the most populous state in the world at that time, okay? And so the bureaucracy becomes a major part of the state and society. It's fielded through education and civil service exams, but importantly, the officials that work for the bureaucracy no longer receive land. We've talked about this before. So you're on salaries, right? So you have money, which is one. And so you're going to have to spend it so that you can, live, living expenses and all that sort of stuff. So there is an increase in terms of the disposable income that is circulating within the economy. Okay, so there's an upward sort of spiral in terms of economic development growth, and the economic pie is increasing. At the same time, because the bureaucracy is one of the biggest contributors in terms of employment, in the East Asian states that have bureaucracies, most of the officials are resident in urbanized locations. So you are looking at large major cities or smaller secondary cities, but the point is the city is the setting, right, for the bureaucracy. And so because of that, urbanization, in fact, increases. And, if you live in a city, there are things that you just cannot do, right? So you can't, for example, grow vegetables and live off the land, okay? So in other words, you would have to be spending money buying food so that you can actually live, okay? And so there are certain kinds of value-added activities or secondary economic activities that then take off and grow phenomenally as a result of this, okay? The bureaucracy grow, the urbanization leads to an increase in the consumption patterns and demands for secondary sort of, products like food. So no longer are you just going to the market to buy raw fish, vegetables, maybe rice and all that. You're still doing that, but you're also possibly going to, for example, a food stall or restaurant and getting a food supply, right? Getting cooked food, right? Your meals, okay? And so then you have all those sorts of activities happening. And along with urbanization are some tertiary economic activities like renting of space, leasing, credit facilitation, and so on and so forth. And so overall, there's a tremendous growth in material consumption patterns during this period of time, right? So it's the impact of the medieval warm period plus the trans-regional interactions across the old world that provide a growing body of material culture and cultural diversity that then leads to an increasing sophisticated palette in terms of material cultural consumption, okay? And the thing is that all of that is kind of pretty okay, I think in terms of historical developments, not really sort of, anything too unsurprising. But the one thing that then happens in East Asia, in fact, is a change in the place of the status of women in society. Because traditionally in East Asian society, women had a substantial contributive role to the economy. So if you think about rural landscapes where there are lots of land agriculture, men and women contribute equally, right, to the economic output in those sorts of an environment. Okay, and if you think of Japan, even politically, up until about 300 AD, you usually had in the Yamato kingdom not just a ruler who's a male, right, but it's like a brother and sister ruling together, okay, in the kingdom. And that tradition really comes from, the kind of tribal societies, sort of like primordial sort of, tribal societies where both men and women had equal contribution towards economic sustenance and growth and survivability, right? Okay, this point in time in East Asian history, by the end of the first millennium AD, one of the interesting things that happens as all of these developments are occurring, particularly the economic developments, is that the role of women begin to decline in East Asian society, even though materially everybody is doing extremely well. Okay, so that's one of the key sort of themes or issues I hope we'll be able to sort of reinforce, I think, in today's class lecture. So just a couple of examples. So this is a scroll painting from China dated to about the 11th century, where it's what we call a scholar's table, right? So a whole bunch of officials gathering together, having, a meal, okay? And the level of material cultural consumption in terms of even just the utensils and the crockery that are used for something like this is a lot more sophisticated than what it was, like, say, about 500 years ago. So in a setting like this, for example, you would have people here who are, all these servants and stewards and cooks that are preparing all the different kinds of food, the little different types of dishes, the sauces, the wines, and all that sort of thing. You have buns that are, being prepared and served at the table, which means certain kinds of culinary skills have to be there, right? Baking, for example, the use of ovens. Nothing new, right? But all these the employment of different kinds of culinary techniques, right, allow you to produce different kinds of food. So in this time, for example, iron has already been prevalent for more than 1,000 years, okay? But iron ore is utilized to produce woks in this period of time. And if you have an earthen pot, so here's a cooking question for all of you, okay? America's Test Kitchen. If you have an earthen pot, what can you make with an earthen pot in terms of dishes? Think about it. If you only had an earthen pot, what can you make? Usually.
Spaghetti.
So okay, so you can boil stuff,
Boil stuff.
right? Yeah. Okay, so you can boil stuff, right? Yeah. You can make porridge. What else can you do? What else can you do with an earthen pot? If the primary means of cooking is boiling, what else can you do? You probably would be able to make what? Yeah, soups, stews, maybe. Yeah. Anything else? Has anybody ever tried frying chicken in it? And why don't we do that?
It's a pot.
Right, it's an earthen pot, right? Okay, you try to fry oil, do deep fry in an earthen pot. I think you might go to the hospital after that, right? Because the pot's going to explode and the oil's going to get everywhere, right? So up until a certain point, about the 7th century AD in China, where they didn't have iron cauldrons yet, right? The culinary repertoire was relatively limited, okay? And then somebody thought it was a good idea to make a wok out of iron. And so by this time, they're producing things like iron wok, for example. And so with the iron wok, you can do things like what? Stir fry. You can what? Deep fry, right? There's a lot of things that you can do with an iron wok, okay? And so what we're seeing here is the application of existing knowledge for the purpose of what? Consumption, okay? And then you have this great diversity of what you can possibly produce as a secondary product from a primary product known as what? Food, right? Agricultural food, like wheat, for example, or vegetables and so on and so forth, okay? And then for each of these different kinds of things, you would have different kinds of containers or ceramic utensils that you would utilize. So for example, this thing here, which is this thing here, all you would use this for would be what? Does anybody know what this would be used for back in the day in this particular setting? Look at it. I'll guess, anybody?
for like dipping, you know, like,
Mhm.
to catch like,
Why?
because you dip and then you can catch the excess and that will.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, good guess, no. Okay. Anybody? Come on, people. Try. Yeah.
Soup.
Soup? Why do you think it would be used for soup?
Looks like a old soup.
Right, it looks like a bowl, right? I feel like, yeah. Okay, good try, no. So this is actually really interesting because this is specifically for wine. Okay. And then of course for us, we would think of, okay, so you just think about without this bottom half, just the stem cup itself, right? And I do apologize, I should have put a scale here. This cup is literally about this size. So it's really small, okay? So it's a small little stem cup. And so if you could see the size, you would know you wouldn't use it for soup, you would have used for something else like a beverage, for example, right? But what is interesting is that the wine is not served cold or at room temperature. It had to be served what? Warm, right? Warm. Anybody's taken anything like sake, like warm sake, right? So the way that they would keep the wine, and this is Chinese setting, okay? So this is rice wine. So the way they keep the wine warm, and that's where this bottom half comes to this, is actually not to catch the drips, but you would put the cup here, and notice that there are holes at the bottom of this thing. It's like a breathing hole, because you would put a little piece of charcoal at the bottom here, okay? So that the charcoal is what? Heating up the wine as you're consuming it so that it stays at a steady, warm temperature, okay? So I don't know about you, but this is like a really fussy way, right, of consuming rice wine, right? But it tells you of the level of opulence in terms of the, like the consumption that we're talking about, okay? And then all these little dishes here are all different little sort of vegetable dishes that you would have, little meat dishes, all prepared in different ways. If you've been to a Korean restaurant, right, you would understand what this table setting would be like, okay? So the Korean practice, culinary practice of banchan or small dishes, okay? And by the way, there's one that's pretty good down at San Francisco Street near a tourist home. So if you have money to spend and you want to try Korean food and not go down to Phoenix, there's a restaurant here that's not too bad. You'll have these little dishes, yeah? And the Koreans pick that practice up from where? From the Chinese, okay? So all of that is to say that, this is a lot of effort for what is effectively a one meal, okay? But that sort of explains the level of sophistication of consumption in East Asia. By the way, this is not just China. In Korea and in Japan, they're also doing similar things like that, okay? So really, really opulent consumption. But it doesn't just involve people who are cooking. It also involves like the ceramicists, for example, who are producing all these things for this particular table, right? And so on and so forth, okay? So there's a lot that's involved in this one picture here, right? Okay, what am I trying to tell you all in these two paintings? Let's see if anybody can guess. What is the main theme here that you think I'm trying to talk about?
Looks like recreation.
Okay, recreation. Yeah, very good. What else? Anybody else? Like maybe people are having lots of babies. No.
The development of like toys.
The development of toys. Okay. Very good. Yeah.
We're bringing up like urbanized activities.
Yeah. Maybe. Okay. All wrong. But never mind. Good try. Actually, this is what I wanted you guys to look at. So Jeez, really? Okay. Yeah, no, really. So the furniture is black, right? It's painted black. So these are two paintings from about the same period, roughly about 100 years apart. But what is interesting is the furniture that's depicted here. Okay, for our purposes. Okay, right? Okay. Furniture is usually depicted in dark colors in Chinese scroll paintings of this period of time. Now, the thing to understand is that the repertoire of Chinese botanical woods for timber, for furniture construction in this time, nothing looks these colors. Like there are no dark colors, okay? So these woods had to be imported from Southeast Asia. Okay, so that if you were a well-to-do family, so this is an imperial family, that's another imperial family, right? And you were constructing furniture, even for children, right? You would be using wood that was imported from abroad, from places like Southeast Asia, India, that had produced, that were known to produce black or dark colored hardwood timber. But then you notice that there are these little these patterns here, yeah. So these are inlaid designs that are inlaid with mother of pearl, the shell, right, of an oyster or clam, really beautiful. And those came from places like what? Japan, because they were known for their marine, right, aquaculture industry. And so here's a piece of furniture that is Chinese construction, but the material is coming in from Southeast Asia, and the decorative material is coming in from what? Japan. And then you put it all together, and then it becomes basically a piece of furniture that's made in China. Okay, and this is the Joseon sheet for you. So in other words, there's no easy way of going about, right, consuming things by this point in time. The level of wealth across the board is so high that you had, if just for a piece of furniture, you had to do it in such a sophisticated way. Okay, so that's China for you. It gets to a point where scholars who would want to buy a ceramic bowl will be looking at this thing and going like, wow, it has, and this is one of the 5 classic ceramics in China of this period of time, and they wrote a treatise on it, okay, about this kind of ceramics. It's kind of blue but a little kind of white, has a slight milky kind of texture to it, and then lustrous. And as you move it around different spots of light, the candles here, they're kind of doing this, it sort of throws off different, sort of colors. And then ultimately you have to install a copper band around the rim, so that when you use it, your lips don't get lacerated, right, by the raw ceramic clay. Okay, so it's pretty kind of out of this world, all right, in terms of the consumption. And then so somebody buys this bowl. It's probably really expensive. Has a little slight crackle glaze, and so it's like very subtle, very sophisticated. And then they write a poem on it and inscribe it there. Okay, so the scholarly consumption is extremely high. Now, here's a question for you: who are the scholars in China, and in Japan, and in Korea? Were they the men or the women? Yeah, right, the men. Okay, so are you getting it now? Right? Okay, so all this literati, high society consumption, the ability to spend, the ability to buy, and the ability to enjoy the opulence comes primarily by the end of the first millennium AD through men, right, with the means. Women generally do not are not part of it. Okay, and so that, I think, is one of the most important things to think about. Okay, so in East Asia, no longer are you sort of circulating goods, right? So back in the day, when China had iron technology, and you guys attended the virtual museum exhibition in Korea, right? The iron object is actually transferred from China to Korea, ultimately to Japan, right? This is a period of time when it's not just the item that is transferred to another country anymore in East Asia, but the technical know-how. Okay, so the Chinese are producing millions of these bowls, these lovely celadon bowls, which are very cheap to them. They don't really think too highly of it. The Koreans look at it, love it, don't want to make it themselves, right? So they buy from China in large quantities. Why? Because it's cheap. So you might as well do it that way. Okay, but they don't become solely dependent on the Chinese kilns to produce celadon for them. They actually learn how to make these things, the Koreans do. And so then in their own kilns, they produce things that the Chinese would not produce, but using the same technology and method and recipes as the Chinese did, right? So you're looking at what we call technology transfer across East Asia, right? It's not just commodities, it's technology as well. So this, for example, is a 12th century celadon that was produced in a Korean kiln. Okay, and the Koreans love this. This is like a national treasure in Korea. Okay, so the mythical kind of dragon-like sea creature, with all the fins and all the finials. The Chinese are looking at this and they're going, what? This is absolutely gaudy. Okay, so like we don't know how to make these things. So the Koreans are producing this for themselves. This is what the Koreans would do. Okay, for the Chinese, this is what we want to do. Okay, the subtleness of that. Okay, and so the Koreans are learning all these sorts of things. And what is interesting is that the technological knowledge that is transferred from China to the Korean peninsula sometimes actually exceeds, okay, the level that the Chinese were able to do. Okay, so this is one of the finest examples of celadon in China in this period of time. Okay, once the Koreans master the art of celadon ceramic making, this is what they actually end up with. Okay. And I don't know about you. So this is 14th century China. It's a bit stumpy. Okay. 13th century China, Korea is able to produce something that is phenomenally more refined in terms of the form. Okay. Now, if I were Chinese, I would look at this and I would go, for example, yeah, it's not really quite my taste, blue and white, in this manner, maybe more to what I would like, right? But the form, in terms of the finesse of the throwing, has anybody done ceramics yet? Who's done ceramics before? Yeah. Did you use a potter's wheel or is it sort of this form is really difficult to make on a wheel, all right? Because the control has to be so precise. Okay. This particularly, this voluptuous. I'm trying not to use, the kind of words, but literally when you open an art book, words like voluptuous come up. Voluptuous, sort of waist, narrow, good, lovely, sort of dainty. Dainty was the word that was in the book. Dainty foot. Okay. So the whole point is even the allegorical words, right, that are utilized in this period of time, suggest certain kinds of things. Now you won't use masculine descriptive terms on that piece of it. You might do it on this one, okay? But you definitely will not do it on this, right? And so what is really interesting is how women are actually looked at, right? Becoming increasingly, in fact, objectified by the end of the first millennium AD. So much so that in the historical treatises of that time describing beautiful aesthetic objects, right? The descriptive words tend to be what? Terms that would otherwise be utilized to refer to what? Women, okay? So we actually see some interesting literary developments during this period of time that start to show the role of women in where they stand in this time, right? So I'm not going to talk about this because it's going to be a bit of a long story, but this is what I want to get to, because we are going to be watching Genji Monogatari, right, in about a week's time for Monday next week, okay? So here's a 1130 AD painting from Japan depicting a scene from the tale of Genji. And what is really interesting, of course, is the depiction of women, right? And here women are what? What are they doing? Anybody can you identify some of the activities that the women are involved in?
I think the one in the middle is reading.
Right. So there's somebody reading here. So women are what? Literate, at least certain women in Japan, courtly women in particular, were literate. So they had the requisite skills. What else?
Looks like the one to the left there is. What's the word? I just forgot.
Dressing somebody's hair, combing somebody's hair, maybe
Yeah.
doing somebody's hair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's quite faint, but this is a comb here that she's holding on to. There's something that she's applying on this other lady's hair, and she's kind of like straightening it out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What else? Anything else?
Girl on the top in the green, it looks like she might be drawing.
Yeah. So she's actually holding a brush, and she's doing a painting on a piece of parchment paper, okay? And the fingering, the fingering technique of holding the brush is actually the correct one. So I don't know if you guys know, but in classical Chinese calligraphy, if you ever go and take a classical calligraphy class in a Chinese context, okay, and you hold the brush like that, okay, you're supposed to hold it like that. This is how you would hold a brush in classical Chinese calligraphy class, okay? And so it's really interesting looking at even just these are the subtle details, right? These are people who are educated, okay? Where are the men? Anybody knows where the men are? No men, huh? Okay, so really interesting. All the women are here. Okay, here's another one from the same scroll painting, but a different panel. Okay, notice they're playing things like chess, so they're really quite able to do a lot of things that the men would do. Dressed in various kinds of clothes that are not really very, good in terms of mobility, physical mobility, right? And so what you have are women that are dressed in many, many, many layers of silk. Really beautiful to look at, but in terms of actually doing things, it's actually quite difficult. Okay, yeah. And so all of the women are in this space, right? Okay. And then there's a wall or a partition that's dividing the space in two. All the women are in there. And then outside of the space, you have what? Yeah, this is guy, okay, who is outside of the space. So you can only access the space where the women are only if what? You own that space, right? Or you're permitted what? Into that space. Okay. So what is really interesting then is that the gender roles in East Asian society, and in this case it's Japan, very clearly demarcated in terms of even just the physical space that we're talking about. Okay, so this is an interesting picture as we look at East Asian women, and then so in the Chinese context, in the Tang period, you find some of these ceramic figurines, right? Women depicted as musicians, playing music instruments and all that. And you can see the basic sort of notions of what would be considered the beauty aspects of women, right? So the rosy cheeks, for example, right? In the Tang period, we really do see women in these sorts of depictions, with fairly sort of puffy or, kind of chubby, like cheeks. Bodies are slightly roundish, the notion of like slim and lithe is not considered beautiful in the Tang period yet. Okay, so this is about the 8th century AD. But you can tell there's still an appreciation of feminine beauty, right, in this, okay? So these figurines are extremely rare. They are not the norm, okay? So these are very rare depictions of women during the Tang period. Most of the depictions of women in the Tang period are like that. Okay, so very robust. Women are on horses, they're playing polo, hello, right? Riding the horse with one hand and hitting the ball with a stick in the other. So very, very different sense of what women and the appreciation of women are. This is actually much more common than the other figurines. Okay, so in the Tang period, until about the end of the 8th century, women were seen in this light, even by elite society. Okay, so this polo, not everybody can play polo, we know that, right? So in elite society in Tang China, this was how women were seen, depicted, and appreciated. Okay. Fast forward 3 centuries into the 12th century AD, and this is what we have. Okay. So this is a scroll painting by one of the most famous Song artists of the time. All right. And it starts from the top there, and you're supposed to look at it this way. It continues over on this side, right? This way, okay? So this is actually one full panel. The only reason why it's chopped in two is because I couldn't squeeze the full panel in, and then it will just absorb the details, okay? But just think of it as one big scroll. So here's a really interesting picture because all of these, by the way, are scholarly men. Okay, so this is like nighttime rest and recreation after a hard day's work at the bureaucracy. Yeah, talking about all the rules in the ministry and all that sort of thing. And so you have all the men sitting around with the food. The women are, sort of surrounded by women who are serving them, right? And then they're enjoying music. And of course, you have interesting things like what? This is a what? This is a bed, right? The bed has been what? Used. Notice that there's a music instrument here, okay? So the courtesan over there is not just a musician, but is she? Okay, we all get the idea, right? Okay. Same thing here too, right? As they're sort of, enjoying a song, women are dancing, clapping. By the way, this is a Buddhist monk. So this guy was inserted there as a moral, like, juxtaposition, okay? Like, just in case all of you forgot, there is still the moral issues we need to deal with, okay? But interestingly, again, there's another one, another bed on this side, women that are waiting essentially what? For something to, for them to be called into what? Into service, right? So Genji Monogatari painting 1130 in Japan still, I think, to some extent depicted courtly women with some dignity, even though their status had already been reduced. They've been kept in this space in there that nobody could access except whoever owns the space, right? In this case in China, within a span of about 300 years, you went from women who look like that, okay, to women who look like that. Okay, and what is really interesting is notice the difference, right? So here you have rotund women, really lovely rosy cheeks. Okay, what's wrong with the women here? Anybody? Yeah, so one, they're like really thin, right? Okay, what else?
They're pale.
Yeah, they're pale. What's going on? Even the men look a lot more fleshly into the flesh color than the women do, right? So a couple of things are happening. So he is essentially depicting like the notion of how we understand like men and women relationship, courtesans and all that sort of thing in an urban setting in the 12th century, okay? By this time, women, the mark of beauty in women is that you have to be what? Skinny, okay? So that's already one big issue. The other thing about women is that they really are what? Pale looking, okay? So these are the kind of like the marks of a beautiful Chinese woman. There are sayings in Chinese like things like Suzhou Chu Mei Ren. So Suzhou is basically the pleasure center around the biggest city in the delta of the Yangtze area, okay, where a lot of officials are located, right? And so this pleasure center, the city known as Suzhou, has been known over the last 1,000 years in Chinese history as the place where beautiful women come from. This is how they're supposed to look like. Okay, they're supposed to be skinny, right? They're not meant to be what? Physically robust. They also have to look very fair. And so for those of us who are Chinese, very often the mark of female beauty in terms of the skin is what? You have to actually be really fair, right? Like a really fair skinned person. Okay, so if you look at cosmetics, for example, one of the biggest types of cosmetics that's sold in Asia is actually the bleaching agent that will make your face look really fair, right? Yeah.
I would just like to bring up my grandma. She doesn't like getting tan, so like my great grandma, she would get tan.
Yeah.
And wear a big hat.
Now they wear big hair. Yeah. 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 There's some really interesting things people will say to you, not very nice. Sometimes, like if you were not, right, if you were tan and all that sort of thing as a woman. And that's not just China, that's Korea as well, Japan as well. Okay. But I'm just using this as an example. So any ideas why these women were beginning to look so pale compared to the other depictions that we had? Anyway, and this will be the last question I'll ask for today.
They're not really allowed outside.
They're not allowed outside, so the notion may be that they're kept indoors all the time so they don't have sun. Good try, no. Okay. Anyone? Why do they look so pale? They don't eat as much? Don't know. I mean, that's a good possibility, but I think that would be true for their, their physical size, but not necessarily the skin color. Huh? Are they wearing makeup? Yes, but the makeup was not the reason why they started to look so pale. So yeah, good guess, but no. Yeah.
Also, Melissa was like wiping like purity or like lighter.
So that became the apocryphal argument, right? The depiction of the fair skin that it represented, like some extent of purity and all that. But that was after they started to look like that. Something was going on here. Does anybody know? No. Okay. Let me tell you what the answer is. Okay. So notice that everybody was wanting to wear lipsticks by this point in time. And so lipsticks are usually what color? Red. How do you get red? You have to use something, right? And so in China and across the whole of Northeast Asia, the only way that you could really get that really beautiful crimson red in cosmetics, especially lipsticks, was by using mercury oxide. So of course they did not know that it would kill you too, right? Over time. Okay, and so they were grinding down all these lumps of mercury oxide from places like Southeast Asia, and then making them into powder on a piece of cardboard. And then women would do this, right? And then you would have what? Red lips, okay? And so that's what they were doing for like a couple of centuries. And then courtesans in particular were using what? Makeup, obviously. And then they were basically poisoning themselves. And so over time, the notion of makeup, physical, like facial beauty, and all that became associated with this pale skin, right? And part of the reason why they were also so lithe, right? They were basically getting diarrhea all the time. So what was really interesting, so do you see the real like sort of like negative sides, right, of the objectification of women that was going on here? Yeah.
When did they stop? Like, when was the time they realized, oh, we've been poisoning ourselves the whole time? Like,
They did not. And
they
yeah, they did not, and even all the way through to the 19th century.
Okay.
And so and so they just kept doing this, yeah, and all the way through to the 19th century. I'll tell you what's really interesting. If you ever get a chance to go look at makeup from East Asia, even today, look at the kind of facial bleaching agents that they would sell at places like SK2 and all that sort of thing. There are quite a lot of ingredients there that are actually highly toxic, but very effective, right? Okay, in allowing you to have a really fair complexion of this nature. Okay, so I leave that with you at least for today.